Hey guys, welcome to the second episode of Trekking It. This video is going to be a little bit different, but I have to come out and confess that I haven't been taking my self-improvement nearly as seriously as I thought I would. So for that, I knew that I needed to change. I'm part of a great online group called Adonis Gang or Adonis School, whatever you want to call it, but the YouTuber Hamza, along with a few others, have this notion of kind of the monk mode, and one of the practices in that is that you shave your head, so that's what I did today. I don't love it, to be quite honest with you guys, but I also don't hate it either, so I see it as character building, and I catch myself being quite prideful sometimes, so I think this is a really good actionable step to be able to humble ourselves. This episode, I want to cover a little bit about fear, and particularly the paralysis that can kind of come with overthinking and fear, and some of the strategies that I've used to overcome said fear. I talked very briefly in my last video that summer of 2023, I moved up to Alaska to come move up here and start my new life. So let me tell you a little bit about that. A little bit of the background, and some of the fears that came up in my mind when planning that expedition and in reality planning my trip to come up here. I started that journey the summer before, actually, the summer of 2022. I knew that I wanted to do something different. I was at this age, I'd been working in a pizza shop for a little while, and life just wasn't that great, to be honest with you guys. I knew I needed to change. Several things happened. I got friend-zoned by quite a few girls in high school, and looking back, the problems seem so small, I suppose, compared to being an adult in the big wide world now, but problems that indeed really just dragged down my mental health. I knew that I had a cousin who lived in Alaska here who did electrical work. So I talked to my mom, and we called him up and said, hey, I hadn't seen him since I was a little kid, but I wondered that at that time I was 17, and I wondered if I could go spend the summer with him and if he would train me in some electrical work, if he needed any help doing anything. He took me up on my offer, surprisingly, so it seemed like just a few weeks went by and I was on the plane to my adventure up in Alaska for the summer. Meeting him was a little bit different than I expected. He was a little bit shorter than I realized, but overall that summer was fantastic. When I turned 18 that summer, instead of throwing a big party like most kids my age, I went out and I went backpacking in the backcountry of Alaska all by myself. I climbed to a beautiful glacier lake, and that was fantastic. There was just something so precious about that moment, about almost that ritual of becoming a man, and what that meant to me. And that I knew that something deep inside me was calling to go and to take a journey and almost to have a sort of a ritual, a rite of passage to become a man. And for me, that was spending the night completely by myself, far from cell phone signal in the Alaskan wilderness. I'll never forget that day. The day when I turned 18. When I shortly got back from school, I had one purpose in mind, and that was to move up to Alaska and to start my new life up there. So I started planning and making arrangements. And it seemed like before I knew it, only a few short months had went by, and I had packed up my grandparents' camper van that I was driving up here for them. And also I brought along my best friend, Moses. Don't get me wrong, I was afraid of what lies ahead, or what lay ahead of me then. I knew that we'd be traveling almost 3,000 miles in a camper van that was a little bit temperamental at times, but I also knew that we would be crossing through Canadian wilderness and through 2 international borders. So don't get me wrong, a lot of thoughts were racing in my head. And so that first day, we set out from Fort Collins, Colorado, with our destination being Anchorage, Alaska. Trouble found us pretty quickly as we were about halfway through Wyoming the first day. We started smelling something sickly sweet coming through the air vents before we heard a small thunk underneath the hood. The engine temperature spiked, and eventually the engine even shut down because it got so hot so quick. I was forced to pull over, which was super hard because I had lost power steering and power brakes, but I managed to bring the camper to a safe halt on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. It turns out what had happened is that the cap for the radiator had popped off, and so nearly all of our coolant was gone. At that point, I kind of had my head in my hands, and I wondered if I'd picked the wrong time to start this journey, and whether I should just turn back now. But I called my dad and told him about my predicament. And let me tell you, I don't think I've ever been so grateful to have a kind and a loving father who knew a thing or two about cars. Per his instruction, Moses and I took all the water that we had and poured it into the radiator, hopefully to limp along to a couple miles to the next town. It was stop and go, only going about a mile to 2 miles before the engine would overheat and we'd have to pull over. Eventually we flagged down a man in a truck. His name was Mario and he was Hispanic, but one of the nicest guys I've ever met. He gave me a ride to town so I could go to the gas station and buy a couple more coolant bottles, and also to get a couple cases of water too, since Moses and I were out of water. From then on out, we kept trucking along, up through Wyoming, into Montana, and eventually to the Canadian border at the town called Couts. The border crossing could have went a little bit better. The swords and everything that I had brought were actually fine. What they didn't like were my switchblades. So, in total, I lost about $200 worth of knives, but if I didn't have to spend the night in jail in Canada for bringing illegal weapons, I mean, just surrendering the knives was the easier option, so I went with that. Throughout Canada, it was beautiful. We drove our way up, stopped to take a rest, and sorry, I'm a little bit tired, but we stopped to wash ourselves at a beautiful crystal clear mountain stream. And we kept driving, and in total we eventually made it to the Alaskan border. We crossed over and were soon in the little town of Tok. Only another day went by and we were in Anchorage. In total, the trip had taken us about 6.5 days. Some of the fears that I had starting out on that expedition, I remember from my journaling, was wondering if I would make it, or if something would happen and I would have to turn back. It seemed almost impossible that this was what I had actually been doing, that I actually had the gumption and the guts to hop in a camper van with my friend and to drive all the way to Alaska. But I made it. Some of the advice that I would have for any of you listening out here, if there's anybody even left watching the video, is that if you're really afraid to do something, I would say, don't be dumb about it. Weigh the risk. It makes sense sometimes to think about the worst possible outcome. Say, for instance, you're thinking about asking out a girl. People say that the worst that they can say is no, and for the most part, that's true. From the time that I've been in high school, I'm out of high school now, if you couldn't tell, but from the time I was in high school, I probably got friend-zoned by, I kid you not, probably 10 girls throughout high school. 10 girls. I did manage to date 3 people, and my last relationship was amazing and beautifully wholesome. But we had to break up because I was moving to Alaska, because I decided to put my purpose at the time in front of my relationship, and honestly, I don't really regret it. She's a great girl, and I have no ill will towards her. But if you're thinking about screwing up the guts just to go do something, whether it be asking out a girl, or even moving away from home to a new state like I did, I would say do it. Be careful. Don't take any, I don't want to say unnecessary risks, but be smart about it. But just do it. Sometimes you have to stop your thinking and just jump. If you go to the pool and you're worried about getting cold from the water and you slowly dip your toe in and then dip your foot in, it'll take you 30 minutes before you actually go swimming. My advice is just jump in. Just jump in the deep end and just do it. Most people watching this are probably relatively young, and that means that you have your whole life ahead of you. So that means just try something. After about a month of being in Alaska, I knew that I had to get a job, and thankfully, I'd been making arrangements a few months prior. I had a connection who worked on the North Slope oil fields of Alaska. He's a family member, but I don't even really know him. I knew him merely by name and reputation, and after only talking with him on the phone about 2 or 3 times, I found myself that I had been hired, surprisingly, because of my resume, and that I was boarding a plane to go spend 2 weeks on a rough oil field up in Alaska, 800 miles away from the safety of my grandparents' home in Anchorage. Going to meet a man who I had never even seen, but who I only knew by name and reputation. Going to stay and work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Don't get me wrong, guys. I was pretty scared, but I knew that I could do it. And I knew that if I didn't like it and I absolutely hated it, I wasn't married to this job. So I took a deep breath and I boarded that plane. That was almost 9 months ago. It was a great decision, and honestly, taking a risk and jumping in and following my intuition and following my heart, even when I was scared, I've never really regretted it. Even with the girls who I got friend-zoned, I'm so glad that I did, because it taught me so much, and honestly, I'm glad I'm not dating any of them now. So when it comes to fear, my advice is just to tell your brain to shut up